Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to tonight's academic forum. Welcome to the audience in the room and on our live stream. We've got two speakers tonight, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker is Professor Mark Wilson. He's a consultant neurosurgeon at St Mary's Hospital in London and is a pre-hospital care doctor for the London's Air Ambulance. So I'll hand you over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Adam, for the invite, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to all the millions of you at home, which seems a bit strange, but anyway. So I've been asked to talk about cardiac arrest, I think. I'm just going to see if I've got a signal to say that I can carry on. I can carry on, good. I'm going to talk about cardiac arrest, if that's right. And the first thing I need to do is just connect up this computer to this one, so you can actually see some slides, and hopefully this will work. Now, I'm a neurosurgeon, which is... That doesn't look very good, does it? I'm a neurosurgeon, which is probably the first worry in terms of what do I know about cardiac arrest. That's a good question. And I'm not going to really talk about the physiology of cardiac arrest, because you're going to have Alex talk after me. This is working fine a minute ago. Alex talk after me about the actual... is that working now? That's not very good. That's not great. Just 2 seconds. I'm sorry for everyone at home that can't see it. Right, fine. So you can have Alex talk to me afterwards about ECMO, which is going to have much more about the physiology and stuff. I'm going to talk to you a bit about sort of my role that I've had recently in cardiac arrest, in particular around alerting and dispatching people, and a little bit about how we can change survival through increasing bystander CPR. I'm not going to talk about how to do CPR. I assume pretty much everyone here is aware of how to do that, so it's not going to be a practical course like that. I have a massive conflict of interest, which is that I'm a co-founder and medical director of something called Good Sam, which is a really rubbish thing to be have as a conflict of interest, because I don't get paid for it, but I mention it because I'm going to mention it a few times in this. But before I actually start talking about the cardiac arrest side of stuff, because I'm going to talk a bit more about where pre-hospital care is going a little bit later on, I thought I'd just have 2 minutes talking about where we've been with pre-hospital care. Is that sort of all right? And do feel free to interact. I know the people at home probably can't interact, but feel free here and I'll repeat your questions and things like that as we go through. So I thought I'd just talk about where we've been over the last couple of thousand years, because we haven't actually come that far until the last maybe 50 years or so, and then I'll talk about where we're going to go, which is quite exciting. So I know I've mentioned Good Sam app a minute ago, and this is not meant to be a reference to it, but so if you go back through history, the Good Samaritan story is probably one of the first sort of pre-hospital care stories, and you can see here that the main modes of management were bandaging the wound, pouring oil on the wine, and then putting him on a donkey and taking him to an inn where he was taken care of. And if you look at pre-hospital care now, we don't do a bit more. We do thoracostomies, we intubate people, but otherwise it's fairly the same sort of principles. And if you look at over the history, you had the Knights Hospitalaire, and then the Order of St John that came in, and we're talking around sort of well, if we come up to sort of Queen Victoria's sort of time, the Order of St John really took on a new level with its Commonwealth distribution, which we'll talk about a little bit more in 10 seconds' time, about how that's shaped pre-hospital care around the world. But at this time, most of pre-hospital care was about transport, and that came really from the Napoleonic side of stuff, where to get people off the battlefield, the first ambulance, the Voltaire, was put in place to shift people off of the battlefield. And if you look, as I say, sort of turn of the century sort of stuff, it was about transporting people. And one of the interesting things, I think, is if you look at the difference between transporting people in the UK and the US. In the UK, they were mostly charitable-based organisations, like St John we just mentioned, whereas in the US, it was about bringing customers in. And that's why you'll find that the differences in pre-hospital care are still quite different, marked between the US and the rest of the world. And there was this guy, Henry Durant, who set up the ICRC from all the people... This is not good, is it? The International Red Cross, from seeing a lot of people suffering at the Battle of Solfanero. And he also went on to create the YMCA, as in, like, not the song, the actual Young Men's Christian Association, which housed people. But going through a couple more slides, it was still all about transport. So this is one of the first motorbike transport vehicles, and if you go to the Korean War, helicopters come in, you know, everyone likes helicopters, but it was still about transport. You strap people to the side of these vehicles and then fly them in. And it was not until this chap, Peter Saffer, started to introduce some concepts that were pretty new. And he sort of set up the ABC mantra. And that's where we start to get an element of CPR kind of stuff coming in. And Frank Partridge, who is a cardiologist from Ireland, he developed the first defibrillator, and he put it in a second-hand ice cream van and made a mobile CCU unit out of it. And that's where it's always started to talk about interventions in the pre-hospital arena. We obviously now have defibrillators the size of your hand, and you've probably seen people talking about defibrillators from drone delivery. But this is where, it's sort of in the 60s, is where there was a bit of a change from pre-hospital transport to being pre-hospital care, providing care beforehand. And now we have the sort of full MERT stuff where actually we're doing stuff in the back of the aircraft whilst flying. And you're going to hear about Ecmo shortly, but we're doing so far more interventions in the pre-hospital arena now than we ever were before. But the fundamental principle is still around providing care. I don't think that's changed, and I think that's a really important thing to remember. So moving on to what I'm really here to talk about, nearly. My interest is in brain injury mostly, and most of the stuff I do is traumatic brain injury as a neurosurgeon. And we talk about primary injury, which is when your head hits the windscreen, and secondary injury, brain injury, is everything that happens after that. I know you've got a whole range of people here, so I don't know if you've heard that concept before, primary injury and secondary brain injury. Have you heard of that? So primary brain injury is the realm of public health. That's road design, seat belts, helmets, all that kind of stuff, preventing the brain injury. Secondary brain injury is our job as clinicians and as scientists. It's our job to intervene and stop the hypoxia, the hypotension, the evolving blood clot, things like that. That's our job, yeah? So if we start right at the beginning, when your head hits the windscreen, one of the things that happens fairly early on, probably, is you stop breathing. And that can be through loss of airway, or it can be through an apneic phenomenon. We are getting to cardiac arrest, don't worry. This is a slide of a graph that was from 1896, show you how old this is. This is a guy called Kramer who took a dog, strapped a metal plate to the side of the dog's head, shot the metal plate, and you can see this dog, I don't know if I've got a mouse or I haven't got a mouse, the dog was breathing along quite happily on the top line there, and then when he gets the head injury, dog stops breathing. Now, Kramer comes along with the dog bag valve mask, resuscitates dog, and dog starts breathing again. If he doesn't bag valve mask the dog dies. And so there's this period of apnea, which if you're ventilated, or if the dog is ventilated through, then actually the dog does okay. You might like to know, those of you who are really interested, that during this period of apnea, there is a catechismine surge, and the blood pressure of the dog goes up as well, and then dog's blood pressure can catastrophically fall off the edge as well, which is interesting from a code red point of view. But this apnea thing appears to be something that occurs in all animals, and these are just some experiments here from different animals, from cats, monkeys, rabbits, dogs, all kinds of things. And it doesn't matter how you hit them, whether you hit them with ballast, with fluid percussion, gunshot, they all stop breathing. And the harder you hit them, the longer they stop breathing for. It's a phenomenon. We don't quite know why it happens, but it's a phenomenon that we don't see in humans usually, because when we arrive there, they've got fixed dilated pupils and they're not breathing, and we maybe do some CPR for a while, and maybe they'll start breathing again, in which case we end up seeing this kind of thing, which is loss of grey-white on CT. But sometimes we can't get a ROSC and we pronounce them dead. We always say that they die of traumatic brain injury if they've obviously had a brain injury. And this is a patient who did die. He came off his motorbike, had what sounds like a period of apnea on scene. By the time he comes to us, we do a CT scan, and you see he's loss of grey-white. He's got a sulcal effacement, and the ventricles are all squashed because of the brain swelling. And he dies of, on his death certificate, traumatic brain injury. Now, I put it to you that he doesn't die of traumatic brain injury. He actually dies of a hypoxic brain injury. Yeah? Because he's not got lots of blood in his head. If he had lots of blood in his head, then I'd be going, yeah, that's trauma. But he hasn't. He's not really got that bad a brain injury. He's had a hypoxic brain injury secondary to trauma. And it's a really important thing to realise is if we're going to minimise these secondary brain injuries, what we need to know is what is the cause of that secondary injury. In this guy's case, it wasn't brain injury, it was hypoxia more than anything else. And that leads into sort of the cardiac arrest side of stuff in a second. Some of you may have heard of John Hines, who worked on, was a motorbike medic in races like the Skerries. Sadly, he was killed a couple of years ago on doing his work. But he used to see a reasonable amount of impact brain apnea, so we spoke about it a lot, where he'd pull the helmet off of someone who's come off the motorbike, they'd be grey, ashen, big pupils, not breathing, bag them for a little while, they'd start breathing again. And often they'd have a CT scan in the end, whether they've been tubed or not, and they wouldn't have that bad a brain injury. Anyway, it's because of this that we actually set up Good Sam, which I'll talk about in a second, as a way of trying to get people to hold an airway open early. I'm going to move on to cardiac arrest now, and I'm going to tell you some basic stuff which I'm sure everyone in this room knows, but like the whole impact brain apnea stuff is you've got a limited period of time to ventilate someone. When someone has a cardiac arrest, you have a limited period of time to do CPR or get an AED out, and for every minute that you don't have CPR or an AED, a defibrillator used, your chances of survival fall by about 10%. And so by the time you're down at 8 minutes, which is sort of supposed to be a standard Cat 1 response time, you can see you've lost a lot of chance of survival. And that's really emphasised by when you actually look at survival statistics. So if you have a cardiac arrest in hospital, your chances of survival are around 50%. But in hospital, most people are pretty sick, so you'd expect quite a few people to die. So that's about right. On the streets of London, your chances of survival are around 9%. And the people walking around the streets of London are pretty healthy, usually, until they have their cardiac arrest. In Heathrow Airport, the chance of survival, if you collapse in Heathrow, is about 80%. They're the same people that are walking around the streets of London. There's no difference really in those sorts of people. So why are these people surviving at 80% and these people surviving at 9%? It's all about AED use and quick CPR. So in Heathrow Airport, there's an AED at every other gate, and all aircrew are trained in CPR and basic life support. So pretty much everyone gets hands on chests very, very quickly. If you look at Wembley Stadium, similarly, really impressive survival figures. But on the streets of London, it's pretty rubbish. So we were developing something about impact brain apnea, but actually it became much more useful in CPR. And like they say, you're never more than 5 meters from a spider. We figured you're probably rarely more than a couple of 100 meters from the off-duty doctor, nurse, paramedic, policeman, fireman, someone who's had statutory training in CPR and AED use. So we set up something called Good Sam, which stands for Smartphone Activated Medics. And it's a tool that sits on your mobile phone. Have you even heard of this? How many people have actually heard of this? Oh, you all heard. Oh, I'll stop now. I'll go home. So basically, it's a tool that sits on your phone and can be. It triggers if there's a cardiac arrest going on around you. And the way this works is works through 999. So when an ambulance service gets a call that's got a certain number of determinants that sound like it's going to be a cardiac arrest, such as not conscious, not breathing, then the system automatically triggers. And it's now merged it's now integrated into most ambulance services in the UK, including East of England is coming online at the moment. Probably to staff first of all, but if you're trained and you're qualified, and I think pretty much everyone here will be, just upload your student ID if you've been trained, or any other form of work ID if you work and it's part of your statutory training, and then you can get on the system. And then when East of England are happy, then they'll be able to alert you to events here. If you come to London, you'll be alerted now, because London alert everyone. And if you go to New Zealand, you'll be alerted. If you go in Australia, you'll probably be alerted as well. So it's probably worth getting on, even if it's not quite live here yet. So we think it's set up now as pretty much one of the most highly governed and advanced alerting and dispatching systems. It's now active in over 30 countries. It's got close to 100,000 people now using it, and it's integrated with CAD in lots of places as well. And we've got lots of survivors. We've been going about 5 years now. You can't see that on here. It gives you the numbers of people in sort of different places, and there's lots of survivor stories. And I'm not going to go through survivor stories; they're what you'd expect. But they're all. These are just a few. There are lots and lots and lots of them. As I say, it's integrated in all these services now. Some of them are now live. Some of the pink ones are now live as well. And if how many of you are on it? Don't tell me all on it as well. I can just go home and stop the advert now. So it's got a few other useful functions in it. You can, firstly, it knows where you are by triangulation. It can override silent. It has a push-to-talk radio in it. So actually, if you want to see where your friends are and meet them for a drink in the pub or in the coffee shop or whatever, you've got a little radio thing you can use on that. It's got the world's largest AED register, and that's because the community has been so fantastic at taking pictures of AEDs and uploading them. And then we believe all that data belongs to the ambulance service. We give that data to the ambulance service. And that's the difference between the red and the orange ones. If you've ever wondered, the red ones are definitely there and the batteries are charged and the pads are working. The orange ones, we know they're there, but we haven't had a proper full check on them. So if you've got in between two, always go for a red one. There's a video function within it, and it's patient reports. Have any of you actually been alerted to it? Yeah, oh, you have? Joe, I don't know if I want to ask you any questions. Was it a cardiac arrest? Or was it?
Cardiac arrest on 2 occasions.
You've been twice?
LAS, yeah.
Oh, blimey.
I'm also a responder for the East of England Ambulance Service, so when I'm working up in London,
Okay.
I take the job with me effectively.
Oh, very good. And have you found it's worked okay?
Yeah, I mean, the siren
It's a bit
I think
annoying.
needs improvement, because when
Okay.
it has gone off, it's, what's that bloody noise? You know?
That's the whole point.
It's not what I'm used to.
Yeah, sure. No, well, I guess yeah. Okay. We're always looking for ways of improving it, so great.
And
Well,
I
good.
can't get the push to talk to work either.
Okay, well, I can have a look afterwards. So it's got this radio function which should work, and it works on should work on Android as well as iOS, and it's really customizable for the ambulance services. They can choose who they're alerting, whether it be one person, 3 people, 5 people, whether it be their own staff, whether it be just their own staff plus police, plus fire, plus the local CFR groups, plus whoever. Well, they've got lots of choices in it, and it can also do things like major incident management. You can upload KML maps in it, so they can change the response radius for different places. It's got lots of other things, so I'm not going to go through as part of this. And as I say, we've been really lucky that the community's really done an amazing job at mapping AEDs. It's about over 100, I think it's over 100, it's well over 40, it's about 100,000 now AEDs that are on the system. That's because people take a picture, they upload it, we strip out the geotags so we can confirm where it is on Google Earth effectively, give that data to the ambulance service, and as I say, we can get them checked. And it's the only system that's got a mobile AED registry as well, because we thought we'd mapped most of the AEDs, so the rest of them are probably in the boots of people's cars. So now you can click on the thing and say, I've got an AED with me, and that means it's being tracked. So there's lots of police cars in London and taxis and things like that are being tracked through that system. Just to give you an idea of a couple of case studies, so not cases of patients, but in terms of how it's integrated. It's integrated, as I say, with London for about 5 years now. They have a fire and forget type policy. It's activated about 30 to 40 times a day in London, and they really came up with some of the governance around it. East Midlands was one of the next in the UK to go live with it, and they've got a much more integrated system, and we really rely on ambulance services to give us data back to know about survivors. But in the first 6 months, when they only had about, or the end of that 6 months, they had 600 staff on the system. So it's probably about an average of 300 people for most of that 6 months on the system as responders. They got 40 ROSCs before the ambulance arrived from people being alerted through the system. So it's definitely seems to be working, and those numbers are much greater now as well, as more and more people have come online. Ambulance Victoria in Australia have been utterly amazing in instituting it, and they're just rolling out to the public, so people beyond the sort of the initial trusted responder group of staff and police and fire. But they've done a lot of integration and made it work extremely well. I'll show you a bit more about that in a minute. If you're in New Zealand, it's across all of New Zealand, both islands, both Wellington Free and St John Ambulance are using it. And they've actually alert the public who are happy to say they're trained as well, not just people who've got a certificate to upload. And it's also working in places like Brazil, India, and parts of Africa now where there is no ambulance service, because it's kind of forming a surrogate ambulance service for those places, using people who are trusted local either medics or at least first aid trained people, not just for cardiac arrest. Actually, it's not used for cardiac arrest very much. It's actually more used for trauma and other things. So that was the first little bit about cardiac arrest. And this is not very interactive, because I'm kind of talking to you, also aware these guys here at home. But if you have any questions, just sort of ask as we go through. So I was going to talk about the next thing that we're doing with this, which is where I was talking about earlier on about where prehospital care is going. So we've now developed this system where we can open up anyone's mobile phones remotely and see what's going on scene. It doesn't require an app. Everything I've told you about so far, you've got an app on your phone, yeah? That's what alerts you. Forget that now. This is for being able to see what Mr. Smith is telling you about when he's dialed 999, and it's an ability to open up people's cameras remotely. So this is my history, the history of the music industry over the last 100 years. We've done the prehospital care industry over the last 100 years. I know that most people in this audience probably don't recognise any of these things. We just download music, don't you? But actually, we used to do that. It's similar for prehospital care. We can't transport patients. Remember earlier on I said about transport. Prehospital care was about transport, and that changed to being about treatment and transport. Well, most of what I do in prehospital care land is actually decision making and deciding what the right thing is. And I don't actually have to do something. I can either there's other people around to do stuff, but it's about you're sick and making up a treatment plan for that person. And the people who are really absolutely key to making these decisions are the dispatchers. So when you dial 999, you go through a series of questions, usually things like, are they breathing? Are they conscious? And it's the decisions that those people make, which is currently very algorithmic based, that determine the response that you get. And I think the future really is here about triaging, both on scene, as in like what the mechanism of injury looks like, how far have they fallen, how big's the fire, how many vehicles are involved, and triaging the patient, how sick they look, and making decisions based around that. And whilst everyone's really interested in artificial intelligence, I'm quite interested in your own intelligence, because actually everyone, you've got eyes that are actually extremely useful at putting lots of information together really quickly. So I'll give you a little demonstration of this. This is a bit of video created by Simon Carley from Manchester, and he went to a gaming company and said, I want you to make someone more sick very rapidly, over 1 minute basically. So this guy over here, a bit relevant to me, he's had a head injury, and he's going to get more sick over 1 minute. And I want you to imagine you've dialed 999, and you're going to ask the questions. So is he breathing? Yeah, he's breathing. Is he conscious? Yeah, he's conscious. So that would make him not particularly urgent, like a green 2, 90 minutes, not very urgent kind of response required. But there's a point where most people in the audience get a bit concerned. So I'll go, is he breathing? Yeah, he's breathing. Is he conscious? Yeah, he's conscious. So still a green 2, that's great. But you all know he's sick, yeah? You can see he's sick. And what you've done to get, within a second, you put into your head there, well, he's grey, ashen, he's got, he's perspiring, he's tachypneic. You're putting all these things into your, making instant decisions about it. And you know that 90 minutes thing is now way out there. He needs help right now, or too late now. But your eyes put a lot of stuff together. So similarly, if you've been told that my husband's fallen down the stairs, yeah, and you see something like this, and this is just a static image, you put a lot of things together really quickly. So he's old, he's landed on marble floor, so he's probably on some kind of anticoagulant, because most of these sort of people are. And if you can see them flexing or localizing, you're also managing to get a bit of a GCS really, really quickly. Your eyes tell you a huge amount. This is a fake bit of video, obviously, but you can also start to say, oh, actually, that's a dangerous scene. Don't go near that chainsaw or whatever it might be around the patient. But it's not just about head injury and potentially cardiac arrest. It's also around mental health. If someone calls in who's clearly mentally distressed, you can actually get an idea of what their eye contact's like, what their affect's like, what the room they're in is like. Is it dishevelled? Are they on a bridge? Are they going to, all those sorts of things you can start to put together. We're doing quite a lot of work now around stroke, early diagnosis of stroke. So being able to see a patient who's complaining of numbness down the side of her face, and you go, actually, you're weak down the side of your face. Can you lift your arm up for me? Lift your arm up and show it's really heavy. This person's clearly having a stroke, and therefore you need to direct them to a thrombectomy centre, or at least a stroke centre first of all. So we've started using this instant ability to see what's going on scene with our air ambulance work now, and there's a paper published a couple of weeks ago showing the benefits of that. There's a little bit of video here. It's not the best bit of video in the world, showing it being used not by KSS but by Great North Air Ambulance. Do you want to just watch that for a second? I'll put it through. It's not, I don't know if the sound will work. Can you hear this? I can't hear this. Can you hear it anywhere? Can you hear it up there? I can't hear you. Maybe I need to just very quickly see if I can just to give us 2 seconds. I'm just going to see if I can do something with the sound. System preferences. Sound. Oh, there we go. Done that. Oh, that didn't help. Oh, no. It's really not worth it. Not to build it up.
As the paramedic on the air desk, it's important that we gather as much information about
the
case as we can.
Let me try once more. It's on headphones. I'm on maximum, according to this.
On the control desk at the
There is one other way.
base over in Teesside.
Oh, should I just put that? You got it? Should I do that?
Is in contact.
It's all right. And you see his foot's pointing the wrong way. As the paramedic on the air desk, it's important that we gather as much information about the case as we can. Obviously, we only have limited assets, so it's important that we only send that asset to the most important jobs and the patients which are going to benefit the most from it. If we send you a little text message through to your phone, would you allow us to use your camera so that we can actually see the injury? Would that be all right? One of the resources that we use is a piece of technology which allows us to access the camera on the caller's smartphone. It actually lets us see what the problem is on scene. In this case, it was a rider who'd fallen off his horse. Okay, so we can see your camera now. Tell them not to move that ankle, just keep it nice and still. Sometimes it's a tricky decision, but in this case there was no question. It was very obvious to us that this was a significant fracture and potentially even a limb-threatening injury.
Obviously it needs ECMO or whatever. But anyway, but you get the idea. The point is that the caller doesn't have to have any apps. There's no FaceTime, there's no Skype, it just opens it. And we can also measure people's pulse. I can do a demo in a minute. Measure people's pulse through the video stream as it comes through as well. So and vital signs. So we can do quite a lot more. And I think that means we can actually provide care before we get there. Now the next bit of video I'm going to show you is pretty horrible. But the reason I'm showing it is because it's in the public domain. It's released by the Metropolitan Police. This guy gets assaulted. It's horrible, and he has a hypoxic brain injury primarily. Again, this could be impact brain apnea, but I want to put it to you that if we could see what was going on, we could be advising people to say hold the airway open. And this guy actually is in the recovery position when he has when he gets assaulted. But actually, we're doing work now in Copenhagen with telephone CPR, so actually advising people how to do CPR because we actually can see what they're doing and tell them where to put their hands and things like that. But and I don't know if you've ever watched these kinds of videos where people get injured either by car accidents, but usually what happens is is everyone gets out their mobile phone after they've done nothing for a while and they start filming or whatever. But actually, if we can use mobile technology for good, as I say, providing care earlier, then that's probably a good thing. And the system can also be used. You can open up lots of people's mobile phones at the same time, so you can have MDTs or sort of debriefing sessions with the paramedic, the fireman, the policeman, everyone that was there on scene. And as that can also be used for major incidents. We're doing some work around drone delivery of AEDs because we've got a good network of people to make sure the drone doesn't get stolen. That means we've got governance around it, and also regarding landing of drones. There's lots of stuff around sort of regulations around that, but actually they can be piloted because someone will be there underneath it. And we're also doing work. I mentioned very much focused on cardiac arresty stuff here, but actually the same system can be used to alert people to elderly fallers, people who have overdosed on opiates, to someone can go and give them naloxone or Narcan equivalent. So there's lots of things that can be done by the same system, and we're working, as I say, with different organisations on that. Now that's most of my stuff about cardiac arrest. Actually, I'll just show you one little bit of video. This just shows you a bit of video from Ambulance Victoria that they show to try and get people like yourselves on the system in their area. Hopefully this will work. There you go.
It was half time.
I walked around the gym for a little bit. I was playing soccer.
My legs just gave out from under me.
I felt really dizzy and collapsed.
I was unresponsive.
And I had no pulse. I had a cardiac arrest.
Luckily, a couple of my teammates knew what to do.
Someone got a defib.
The guy started CPR.
The defibrillator restarted my heart.
When someone is in cardiac arrest, every second counts. The sooner somebody receives CPR and defibrillation, the greater their chance of survival. Saving lives is always a team effort. That's why we've partnered with GoodSam. It's an app that alerts off-duty professionals like you to cardiac arrests nearby. If you're a medical professional or qualified first aider, please join us. Register as a trusted GoodSam responder today.
If those guys hadn't been there, or if they hadn't been able to get a defib, I wouldn't have survived.
Powerful bit of film, but it's sort of like showing that how you can get people motivated to come on, and then and that's how we increase numbers. That increased numbers massively in around Ambulance Victoria. Now, shall I just do a little demonstration of the system working, or do you want to learn about brain injury, or a bit of both? I've got about another 10-15 minutes, I think. How long have I got? 10 minutes? I'll just do a quick demo and then see if we finish this bit. Where's my it's over here. Oh, you can read all my emails and everything. Hold on a second. That could be disastrous, couldn't it? Let me find another bit of. Here we go. Nope, that's not what you want to see. Hold on 1 minute, I've got to find my mouse. Where's my mouse? There it is. Okay, right. Okay, let's move that over there. Okay, I'm just going to keep, because there's some, these are cardiac arrests going on at the moment, okay? You can probably see, the lat longs are on there, so I've just removed them so you can't see where they are. Just because if it's going out on things, I don't really want that going out. So just show you how it works in terms of the video side of stuff. You can open up anyone's mobile phone cameras, as say remotely, by just typing in their number in here, which I'll do here. I can either use someone else's number or I could use my own. If you don't, shall I use my own? Unless anyone wants to give me the number.
078.
This is going out on Facebook.
I'll give me
Oh,
1
sorry.
second. I'll just
Sorry.
my number. 078 25 835 193.
Okay, so I can't quite see what I'm doing here, but you should have got a text. You should get a text in a second, if I got that right. Let me move that down there so I can actually see what I'm doing. Did you get a text now? Huh?
I gave his number.
Okay, give us your number again.
07825.
Oh, that'll be why it's not working. 07825, yep.
835.
Why is that not working? Sorry, 2 seconds, guys. It's not, it's logged down, that's why. Just 2 seconds. Sorry, it's not a great thing to try and do live, is it? Okay, go for it again.
07825 835 193.
Okay, so if you dialed 99 now, we'll be saying to you, okay, it'd be really handy if we could see the patient you're with. You're going to get a text from us in a second, which you got, yeah? It's going to ask if it's okay to share your location data and share your video data. If you could say yes to both of those things.
Yes. I've got 4G.
Oh, well, yeah. So if you say yes to those things, so it's found out where you are, so you're in Robertson College, so we know now where you are, yeah? And then your video should, if the Wi-Fi and everything's allowing it, should come up here. There you go. So, so there's no app, you haven't downloaded anything for that. And if you just stare at it for a second, someone's face for a second. Okay, let me make it a bit bigger for you. So you see it's put a red box around his face. Just move it away and put it back on his face again. Sorry, there was a second. And put it back on again. Oh, it's not going to work with the light there. Just the light might be rubbish. Do you want to just point it at me for a second? It should find my face, and then there should be a red box around my face. Yeah. And the bottom right hand corner will be my pulse rate, which you can check if you want. Sorry if I turn away. Yeah. Usually about 60, although the longer it takes, the more nervous I get. Oh, 60, that'd be Anyway, so we can get, my point being is you can get sort of these sort of vital signs remotely, which give you some kind of objective evidence as to what you're doing now. Let me take that away. Right. Cool. So I'm just going to cancel that down. So you get an idea of how that works. Anyhow. Let me just go back to my talk now if I can. Right. There. So I think we've got another 10 minutes. Do you want me to, I was going to talk a bit more about brain injury stuff, because I could talk about cardiac arrest, but I feel that you're going to have an excellent speaker talk about the physiology of it all in a minute, so you don't need me talking about that. Is that all right? But I will talk to you about brain injury, because it is something that I'm particularly interested in. And if I've got 10 minutes, I'm going to whiz through some fairly important aspects, not necessarily the science aspects of it, but the ways to think about brain injury being slightly different to where you're probably taught, if that's okay. So these two guys, Brian Jeanette and Graham Teasdale, were the people who founded GCS 44 years ago now. So it was in 1974 they found that. And just to give you an idea what a big thing that was, before then, the descriptions of consciousness were really difficult. Even though consciousness is a relatively simple thing, it's content and wakefulness, yeah? And you can have wakefulness with no content, but you can't have content with no wakefulness. Even though that consciousness is a relatively simple thing, putting it into some kind of scoring system was a big deal. These are the words that used to be used to describe levels of consciousness. And then they came along and invented the GCS in 1974, and that really revolutionised how we follow up brain injuries. And you've got to bear in mind, 1974 was pretty much pre-CT for most hospitals. And so they were classifying head injury as mild, moderate and severe based on these GCS numbers, yeah? And I put it to you that that was great then, but it's not so great now, because we all know you can have an extradural hematoma, be GCS 15 and die from it, but you could equally be postdictal and be GCS 3 and be absolutely fine. So this isn't a really good way of describing what GCS is. And just to go through all these different types of brain, well, let's go through these different brain injuries now. It does tell you underneath what they are, so that might help you. But the top right hand one there, or the top one over there, which has got EDH under it, what kind of brain injury is that? Extradural hematoma. So I like to ask this question: is an extradural hematoma a primary or a secondary brain injury? Bollocks. Let's try again. Well, I would argue that it's not a brain injury at all. That if we take that extradural out, if we take extradural out, then that person will go home a week later and be absolutely fine. That's not a brain injury. The primary injury is when the head hits the windscreen and they get a skull fracture. The secondary brain injury is if they get a brain injury at all, it's going to be when the blood's been putting pressure on the brain for a long while. But currently that person does not have a brain injury. Contrast that to the person who's got this contusion in the next picture, yeah? That's definitely a brain injury. And with neurosurgeons, we tend to operate on people who have got extraaxial, so blood outside the brain, so subduals and extraduals, so subduals are below. Subduals are associated more with rotational injury. I might just find another dongle if I've got a second. So subdural hematomas are associated with, as I say, with a bit of parenchymal injury as well. But the extradural hematomas definitely very rarely have parenchymal injury. So we think we do really well. When people come into clinic with a big scar on the side of their head because they've had an operation, everyone goes, oh, he's had a really bad brain injury. Most of them haven't had that bad a brain injury. The ones that have had a brain injury are the ones we don't operate on, who look absolutely fine, but are absolutely not fine, who are really angry, aggressive, their marriage is falling apart, they're losing their job because actually they're then really not quite as they were before. I'm just going to find another dongle. Give me 5 seconds. If that's all right. I come with a spare. Sorry about that. So I think the main emphasis here is to think about brain injury being a spectrum of diseases. It's lots of different things. It's not one. Although we all have a traumatic brain injury protocol in the places we work, brain injuries, extradurals, subdurals, contusions, diffuse axonal injury, subarachnoid blood, diffuse swelling from hypoxia. There's lots of different types of brain injury, and currently we don't actually we manage them all the same. Certainly in the prehospital environment, we manage them all the same because you don't actually know what's going on. And actually, when you start to look at this even in more detail with MRI, you can look at diffuse axonal injury more closely with the sort of the microhemorrhages that occur with it, and you can look at axonal injury specifically using things like diffuse intensity imaging and seeing where the actual disconnections occur, and concussion. Just so this is another big topic, but concussion, if you want to use that term, which I don't really like, is about axons that are not necessarily broken, but they're not working as well. And that, for example, they've been stretched and the microtubules have fallen apart, and they're not transporting neurotransmitters like they normally would do. That's another whole spectrum of discussion. And if you look at if you look at SPECT and things like that, you can see other areas that are damaged that become epileptogenic focuses and things like that. But brain injury is a really big group of different diseases. And one of the things that I feel quite passionate about is that we don't necessarily appreciate the effect that has on society. Certainly where I work in West London, I see a huge number of people who are homeless or alcoholic, who have a head injury, and they go through this cycle. And often these people were not homeless and alcoholic to start with. They were out at the pub after a work do or whatever and fell down, hit their head, and then they become much more aggressive after they've hit their head, and then they lose their job, as I say, and then their life falls apart. And if you actually start to look at the vulnerable populations, homeless population, this was in a study by Oddy a few years ago now, nearly 50% of the people, homeless population in Leeds report having had a significant brain injury, admitted overnight, at least overnight, previously. And similarly, the prison population, similarly, much higher rate, 65% of having had a significant TBI. Now, these people, there might be some reporting bias in this, but there's definitely a link. And I certainly see this kind of phenomenon going on where people go round and round this circle. And it's about when people lose their frontal lobes or have damaged their frontal lobes and they become disinhibited. And people get better from that, but there's a period of time, especially in the first few months after their injury, where they're very, very vulnerable. And currently, we don't actually do much to look after those people in that very vulnerable period of time. So, minimising secondary brain injury. We've talked a little bit about hypoxia minimisation, and we said hypoxia is a bad thing. Hypotension is also considered to be a bad thing. And so, from a prehospital point of view, they're the two main things that we try and avoid. Another thing, I'm not going to talk about things like mannitol and hypertonic cell and all that sort of stuff. We can talk about it a little bit, but one of the other things we need to think about is intracranial pressure. And I'm just going to give you my version of intracranial pressure because I know it's right, but it's not what you get taught normally. What we get taught, how many of you have heard of the Monroe-Kelly Doctrine? That's good, quite a few of you. So Alexander Monroe said all those words there about 200 years ago, and he was a physician in Edinburgh, and it's from his work that we now talk about the skull's a closed box. Have you heard that sort of stuff in ATLS, Advanced Trauma Life Support? And if you put something in your brain, or in your head rather, you have to push something else out, which is where this graph comes from in ATLS. And basically the story of all these people going along here, so there's another guy there, Abercrombie, who's the 1828 guy. He was a pathologist in Edinburgh, and he said no matter how you die, the volume of blood in your head is always the same. And just to make you think about that a little bit, so that means if I shoot you and you bleed out, and your spleen at post-mortem will be all shriveled up, but when you take your head off and drill a burr hole and let the blood out, the blood is still the same whether you'd been shot in your chest and bled out, or whether you'd been hung. Your cranium keeps the blood in your head. Make sense, yeah? And the way you get blood out of the head is, I say, you do a burr hole and open the drill and the blood pours out. Because the reason why it's really important is because we all think that the skull is here to protect us from sticks and bricks and things like that. Your skull is here to actually protect you from the atmosphere. Yeah, it's the only organ that has a skull that has a bone around it to stop the atmospheric pressure squishing it. You don't really think about that, do you? But it is a really important thing. So if I do an operation, take someone's skull off, then their brain sinks inside and they get syndrome of the trachea and they can't move the opposite side of their body because actually the atmospheric pressure is pressing on their brain. So the skull's an important thing for that. And then Magenda, he discovered CSF. So these guys didn't know about CSF. And then Burrell said, I know, I'll rewrite the Monroe-Kelly Doctrine from because now the CSF's being discovered. He was from UCL, no one liked him, everyone ignored him. And then Harvey Cushing said exactly the same thing, and not because he was from UCL, I'm sure. And everyone listened to liked Harvey Cushing. So now that's where you get that skull's a closed box thing. And so when we do talk about intracranial pressure, we talk about different ways of reducing it using head-up, sedation, paralysis, all that sort of stuff. And I'm not going to go through all that because I haven't really got time. But there's lots of really interesting physiology in here. For example, when you're in space, what happens to your intracranial pressure? Up mountains, when you massively increase your cerebral blood flow because you're hypoxic and therefore can't drain enough quickly. And that's a bit like, this happens on scene, but we can't see it. But, you know, if this says someone who's got an FiO2 of 12% versus 21%, big venous engorgement, because what they're doing is they're massively increasing their cerebral blood flow in to maintain brain oxygenation. You only got two little tiny holes for that to go out for your jugular foramen, and so you're altering these dynamics in front of you. And so I'm going to flick through that a bit quickly, but this is the way I think about intracranial pressure. It's not just the stuff that goes on inside your head, but actually it's the stuff that goes on in your neck, from pressure from collars, all that sort of stuff, from your chest, from being hypoxic, massively increasing your cerebral blood flow, and if you've got something on someone's abdomen as well. So if we're doing an operation where someone's opening up an abdomen and we're opening up a head at the same time, and then when they close the abdomen, the brain starts to herniate out at you. That's because the abdomen and the brain are totally connected through the IVC and SVC. And so the pressure inside your head is not just the extradural that you see on scans. Does that make sense? Always think about what else is going on. So don't put the oxygen cylinder on someone's chest or abdomen to transport them, because what you're doing is massively increasing their intracranial pressure. Now, I realise I was told I could talk to 20 past, so I'm pretty much there, really, aren't I? I'm not going to mention any of this stuff. It's really interesting. dear, what a shame. It's really, really good. Oh, this was so fascinating. There we go. So I'm pretty much off. There we go. So I'll end it there. And if anyone's got any questions, then you can ask away. I don't know what happens to the people on Facebook, but you can ask away. Thank you. Cool. Any questions? No.
How does the phone calculate your heart rate?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we've got a little algorithm that looks at a few little things, skin colour being one of them, and it works it out from that. But it's very accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard you briefly say the word concussion, but then
Yeah.
I'd like to use that term.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I've got to repeat the question, which is about concussion. So why don't I like the term concussion? Concussion over the last 200-300 years has had a number of different meanings. So if you go back about 300 years, it meant not just loss of consciousness, but stopping breathing. It was originally impact brain apnea, that stuff, yeah? And then about 100, 200 years ago, it became loss of consciousness. And now more recently, it means to most people, I feel a bit funny after I've hit my head. So there's no clear definition of it. I'm worried that it implies that it's not really a brain injury, if you see what I mean, because it's just a concussion, it'll be all right. And actually, when you start doing all that's I think what way we think about this is if it doesn't show on a CT scan, you've not had a brain injury, and therefore it's concussion. But CT, to be frank, is absolutely rubbish, really, at picking up these microhemorrhages. You know, if you do an MR on a lot of these people, you'll find little tiny dings. They've got a little bit, and even MR is not that good. And, you know, when we start getting better, we'll be able to look at hopefully the axonal transport system's not working and things like that. So the term concussion seems to be defined by our limits of imaging. And if it doesn't show up on our imaging, you've had a concussion. Do you see what I mean? But it's still a brain injury. So I don't really like it for that reason. But I don't like the term mild TBI or moderate TBI either, because these people are often the people whose lives fall apart. So they can be far more seriously affected than someone who's actually had a very severe brain injury with a big craniotomy, but they've actually not actually had a brain injury at all, as I was just trying to explain there. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So that's my take on it. Cool. Alrighty.
A couple more questions.
Oh.
More questions from the live stream.
Oh, blimey.
So
someone was watching. It's a real thing, is it? Is there a risk of bystanders filming a scene? Are police services aware this is being trialled? So, did you guys have the first one you want to answer? Or do you want to answer?
Go for that first.
So I don't know whether we're talking about from a cardiac arrest point of view, or whether we talk about the streaming thing. So just go on the streaming side of stuff. Nothing is stored on the person's phone at all. That just goes straight away to whichever service wants to view it. Yes, I mean, with the way we've got an algorithm which we did with Kent Surrey Sussex. So if people are asking why you're filming, they can say, I'm showing the ambulance service, basically. So actually, that gets around that issue. And the police services where we've been working seem to understand that. So it's not been an issue.
And then just the other one was the difference between the red and the green icons.
What's the difference between red and green people? So red people, so green people are on your side, basically. They're in your team. So if you are, for example, registered under London Ambulance Service, then all the people in London Ambulance Service are green to you. If you are registered under Good Sam, then all the people who are Good Sam registered are under you, and everyone else is red. That's a simple thing. That's a simple way of explaining that. Cool. Alrighty, thank you. Oh, go on. Yeah, sorry.
There was one interesting piece, like I think 100 years ago, about Phineas Gage, I think it was.
Sorry.
Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage. Yeah.
So he had like
A metal pole go through his head. Yeah. Long while ago.
I was just wondering what's kind of the survival rate for that.
Of metal poles going through your head.
Yeah. Like, imagining like.
It does depend where it goes through your head. But you know what? You'll be surprised at sort of penetrating injury. Survival is actually really pretty good for low velocity penetrating injury. For high velocity, you know, gunshot through and through one side are very, very poor. Even though some people do survive that now, it is still extremely poor. But for low velocity, in particular things like knives in heads, I've got a whole talk on that. But that's but actually because they're usually very focal injuries, people are really genuinely mostly fine. The Phineas Gage had a fairly big tamping iron thing, which is a fairly big pole that went through his eye as well. So he's slightly different, but he did survive with a few changes. Yeah, cool. Alrighty. Okay, thank you very much.
Right, thanks very much, Mark. As ever, stunning talk, and we will definitely have you back to do more brain trauma stuff, because I'm absolutely sure that will be well received by everybody. Okay, so on to the next phase. Second talk of the night is Dr. Alex Warren, who's one of my colleagues at Adam Rooks Hospital in the Division of Anaesthesia on the Neurocritical Care Unit. Now, Alex has got an academic appointment and has already carved out something of a special interest in Ecmo, which is at the cutting edge of current thinking around pre-hospital and in-hospital cardiac arrest management. So I'm absolutely delighted that Alex has joined us tonight. We are running slightly over time, which is absolutely fine, and I totally anticipated it with Mark speaking, so I'm not going to rush Alex. We've got the room for as long as we want. If you guys in the audience are happy, and if you guys on the live stream are happy, we'll just let Alex run. If you need to go off, we won't be offended, but we're not going to rush anything tonight because it's all great content. So without any more jabbering, I will hand over to Dr. Warren, and thanks so much, Alex.
Thanks very much for that introduction. It's difficult act to follow with Professor Wilson, particularly when he's tantalisingly dangled a talk about knives in the head for you. But hopefully, like I say, Adam and the team will invite him back and you'll get to see that at some point. I'm going to be talking about Ecmo Assisted Cpr. I'm going to try and cover in about half an hour what it is, how it's done, why people do it, who it should be done on, when it should be done, and perhaps one of the more controversial ones, where it should be done. But I've changed these slides slightly since the last time I gave this talk to try and talk about medical cardiac arrest in general. And I think in a way I've designed to try and complement Prof. Wilson's talk, because the things you've just heard about, the things that are going to save lots and lots of lives, getting bystander CPR to people, getting AEDs to people, and getting them to the appropriate place as quickly as possible, is going to save far more lives than anything I'm going to talk about. And often people who talk about ECMO feel they have to justify why they talk about it at the start, and I'm falling into that trap. But I hope to convince you, if nothing else, of the patient population that has an unmet need. First, a little disclaimer. Unlike some of the other speakers you've heard tonight, I'm not an expert in this. So I'm an FY2. I work in critical care at the moment. I'm very much an enthusiast. But when I was at Papworth doing some of my critical care academic stuff, they barely let me touch the machines. So whilst I'm fairly up to date on the data side of things, I disclaim now that I'm not as technically expert as some of the people who I'm sure were busy tonight when Adam emailed them to ask if they would talk. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a case story. I'm going to invite you to imagine a patient. Just in terms of the audience, who is a pre-hospital person, who's a paramedic, student paramedic, ambulance tech, something like that? So about half of you, and the rest I shouldn't be in-hospital professionals. So I'd like to imagine this man. We'll call him Fraser. Okay, he is your average cardiac arrest patient. He has high blood pressure, he smokes a bit, he likes his processed foods and has high cholesterol. He doesn't really see the doctor about any of these things because he's a fit and well 45-year-old and he's out shopping in the Grand Arcade in Cambridge on a Saturday morning when he has his out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. Fortunately, the East of England have linked up with Good Sam and an alert goes out, and within 30 seconds of Fraser collapsing and losing his output, bystander CPR begins. So he's had this no-flow time of less than a minute when that brain hasn't had any oxygenated blood going to it. Fortunately, again, because of the fantastic pre-hospital care network, someone arrives with an automatic external defibrillator and knows how to use it. And within 2 minutes of Fraser's cardiac arrest, he gets his first defibrillation. So everything that could go right for Fraser has gone right so far on his cardiac arrest. Then some people from the East of England Ambulance Service arrive, and they do some exceptional cardiac arrest resuscitation. So this is a still from a video uploaded by the London Ambulance Service, narrated by Mark Whitbread, who's a consultant paramedic there, who's done some fantastic work on pre-hospital cardiac arrest. It's a bit pixelated, which I apologise for, but they call this the circle of life. But you might have heard of it as the pit crew model of resuscitation. Paramedics, is this something that you guys have been taught? But what it refers to is a system of working in terms of pre-hospital cardiac arrest care, which allows any paramedic who arrives, because you won't arrive all at once usually, to know exactly what role they need to fill, just like a Formula One pit crew, and to be able to work in those roles interchangeably as they turn up at the scene, provides clear leadership, and it makes sure that all the important things get done, because we know that you'll hear this time and time again, that getting the basics done well is the key to surviving a cardiac arrest. And so what these guys do is, with uninterrupted chest compression, or minimal interruptions in chest compressions for defibrillations, they're making sure that they've got a full heart that's pumping oxygenated blood to Fraser's brain, and that they're giving each defibrillation time to work. And you'll all hopefully recognise this. If you don't, if this is new to you, this is the Advanced Life Support algorithm from the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation. Assuming most people are familiar with, what we get is we get 2 minutes of CPR, we get a shock afterwards, and then we get minimal interruptions, and we do all of the normal things of giving oxygen and making sure that any obvious reversible causes are addressed. And these reversible causes are just down there at the bottom of the algorithm, because what really matters is that algorithm. And that's where I'm starting to move away from this, because let's say we've been there 15 minutes now. Every 2 minutes, he's still in VF. We've given a shock. There's still excellent CPR. What else are we going to do? And if you go on an ILS course or an ALS course, which are fantastic and mean that we're all talking from the same page when it terms cardiac arrest, the treatment of reversible causes is something that you might just run through at the end, but realistically, the things that you can do to address them, with some exceptions, for example, the tension pneumothorax or hyperkalemia, which you're not likely to encounter, but even if you do, you're not necessarily going to be able to recognise and treat in the pre-hospital environment, are the kind of things that you'll do as part of a good cardiac arrest management anyway. So you'll be giving the patient oxygen via a supraglottic airway device. You're going to perhaps be running some fluids in. You're going to be giving adrenaline to restore vascular tone and try and increase preload to the heart and, reverse hypovolemia. But it's been 20 minutes now. You've been doing all of that, and Fraser, when you put the monitor on him for your 10th pulse check, is still in ventricular fibrillation. So what now? What are we going to do? Any ideas? You've got 6 of you at this scene. Hems are busy, but, they're not carrying anything extra that they can do. Any ideas? The team leader's standing at the end of the patient. Anybody got any suggestions? Dual sequential defibrillation. I like that. I may be talking about that very soon. Anything else?
Is the answer Ecmo?
Not necessarily, but it might be. But anything else?
Pad positioning, change of pads, fresh pads.
Pad positioning, that's quite reasonable. But the things that we have in our pre-hospital and largely in many places in hospital armoury, could we give some other drugs? Amiodarone, lidocaine. We did the trials, they don't work. Okay, we still give them, but the randomised controlled trials fundamentally show that giving amiodarone versus a placebo doesn't increase your survival in a shockable cardiac arrest. Some people would try lidocaine, some people might try magnesium or something else. There are some small case reports of successful terminations of refractory VF with esmolol, which is a long-acting beta blocker. But that tends to be in the context of people who've had low flow states of something like sepsis, they've had PEA arrests, they've had significant amounts of adrenaline, then they've got a sympathetic surge and ended up in VF. We could try intubating the patient, but we've had Airways 2 come out, and we know that compared to putting an iGel down, in the majority of cases, that doesn't work either. What about dual sequential defibrillation? So this is something which is controversial, but I think the evidence is largely in favour of it. Like many things, if you've seen in-hospital cardiac arrests, people only start thinking about really addressing some of these reversible causes. The classic example is thrombolysis. It's always thought about really, really late. Patient has a PE. They know they've got a PE. They're sat waiting for their CTPA scan or something like that, or they're being treated with heparin and they're sat on the medical ward and they have an arrest in the middle of the night. People turn up and they work the algorithm, they get the good CPR on, and after 25 or 30 minutes they say, oh, should we thrombolyse the patient? And someone's like, oh, I don't know, we've been going for half an hour, the pH is kind of low. And therefore this self-fulfilling prophecy comes out that thrombolysis doesn't work. For PE-related cardiac arrest. And that's only because it's not thought about early enough. And sorry, I've digressed a bit there, which I tend to. But if we talk about dual sequential defibrillation, what it is basically putting two defibrillators on the patient at once, one in the traditional anterolateral position and one in the anteroposterior position. Again, one of the reasons this is confusing is people talk about two different things. So there's dual simultaneous defibrillation and dual sequential defibrillation. Dual simultaneous defibrillation is where you basically just count down 3, 2, 1 and push the buttons at the same time. Dual sequential is where you set one of the defibrillators to the sync mode, which it will pick up an R wave from the first defibrillation and hit one and then the other. It's not particularly clear which is best, but basically what you're trying to do here is deliver double the amount of energy through various different planes, and there's some physiological theory that depending on the origin of your arrhythmogenic focus within the heart for VF, that you're more likely to succeed. This was in vogue in the 90s. Some people in Maryland published some interesting observational data. But then there were several studies that came out suggesting that it probably didn't work, and people moved away from it. But there was a paper published from Canada just a few weeks ago, actually, that suggested that if you do this early enough, it might work. So they looked at about 4,000 cardiac arrests, and they found that and the ones they analysed were about 250 of them that were in refractory VF, and the definition of that is 3 or more shocks that have failed to cardiovert the patient. And they found that if you did it between shocks 4 to 8, then your chance of reverting to sinus rhythm was 30% compared to about 18% if you just gave a standard shock. So we don't have randomised evidence on this. I doubt we will at any time soon. But I think this paper certainly shows a pretty significant signal that if we're thinking about this, it's something that we should do early. And it's something that I think lots of, certainly if you look at the cath lab, the coronary care environment, patients who are arrested in those kind of environments, this is something that's being considered more and more. Now, the gentleman over there mentioned changing pad position. I think that's a really important point as well. And it's quite possible that actually the advantage from this isn't necessarily from doubling the energy, but from delivering an anterior-posterior defibrillation. And if anyone's worked in cardiology, when we do either elective or emergency cardioversions, the preferred pad placement, not just for VF, but for any arrhythmia, AFs, SVTs and VTs, is to go antero-posterior. Anatomically, we know that in children, that's the position we use, and in younger athletes, I'm aware of several case reports where with refractory VF, 10, 20 shocks, someone's come along, switched the pads to anteroposterior and successfully reverted the patient. So this is not in the algorithm. And this is what, if there's one thing you take away from this, apart from all the amazing life-saving stuff that Prof. Wilson's talked about, it's not necessarily the clever fancy stuff that I'm about to talk about, but it's that mindset of the algorithm is not the treatment for medical cardiac arrest. Okay, the algorithm is great for the first responders, but all of us are here tonight when we could be in the pub or watching the football or something, because we want to be more than that. We want to be, people who turn up, look at cardiac arrest like a disease and try and figure out what's gone on and caused it and what we can do about it. And then moving on, so let's say we've tried that twice and it doesn't work and Fraser's still in cardiac arrest. Now what? So this is the situation, I think, that does exist, and there's data that that our standard ALS management fails in somewhere between 60 and 80% of patients, and some of those people are dead, but some of them will be alive. And many of us may have seen this, depending on how many cardiac arrests you've seen. Let's say you've got this person. It's very similar. I loved Prof. Wilson's talk about, well, if they're not dead, they shouldn't die. And these patients won't look dead. They have no reason to be dead. They had immediate bystander CPR. They had really quick defibrillation. And sometimes you go and you're seeing these patients, they've had CPR for 30 minutes, but their pupils are reacting. They're biting at the tube. You know, they're starting to localize to pain, but they're still in cardiac arrest. So what can we do for these patients? And that's what I'm going to try and persuade you that eCPR might have a role. So what is it? So this is an Ecmo machine. It's about that big, about the size of a microwave standing on its end. And they used to be much bigger. And fundamentally, it's a box that can act as a heart and or a lung, a lung and or a heart, I should say, depending on what configuration you set it in. And these are the two basic ways that you can set this box up. And if you can imagine, the box is basically between these two tubes at either way. So on the left-hand side, we've got a vena-venous configuration where we put a big tube in a big vein, so be that femoral or jugular. We take blood out, we put it around an artificial oxygenator, and we put it back into a big vein. And that won't help your heart at all, but if your lungs have failed, and that's what ECMO is mostly used for in this country, and that was some of the work I've been doing as part of my research over the last few months, then that can potentially help you oxygenate your blood and get oxygenated blood to your brain, whilst you can't do it with your native lungs. And the VA consideration is basically supporting the lungs as well as the heart. So same starting point, put a big tube in a big vein, drain blood out, put it through an oxygenator, then you put it through a pump and put it into an artery. And this is where the physiology gets a bit more interesting, because what you'll then have, and this is a femoral configuration, which is the way it's usually done in cardiac arrest management, you'll have oxygenated blood flowing the wrong way up the aorta, up the descending aorta, to the aortic arch, and then to the brain. So once you get above the aortic arch, you're going the right way, but below in the descending aorta, you're actually having counterflow of oxygenated blood up the descending aorta. Now that causes some problems when you're on the intensive care unit and you're using it for hours, days, etc. But for these patients who are dead, all we want to do is restore that oxygenated blood flow to the brain. And that buys you time, which I'll talk about a bit later. How do we put it in? So any of you who've seen a central line be put in or an arterial line be put in intensive care, the guiding principles are the same, but the pipes are just a hell of a lot bigger. So this is something called the Seldinger Technique, which is a regular thing done in intensive care for various procedures. You put an ultrasound probe on, and that allows you to identify your vessel. You put a needle in, and you can see it's in the right place on your ultrasound, and you get blood coming out. You put a small metal wire in through the needle, take the needle off, and then you put a plastic sheath in over your wire and take your wire out. For ECMO, we would repeat step 3 several times. So with various bigger plastic sheaths, we can then make the tract that's going into the vessel bigger and bigger and bigger until it's big enough to put in the ECMO cannulas. And we use very, very big pipes. So you're looking at something about the diameter of your index finger. One into the femoral vein usually, and one into the femoral artery. Various different ways that you can go about this. So Seldinger Technique's the most commonly used, and here's an example of a VA ECMO circuit in situ. So on the left side, I'm not sure how the lighting is, but you might be able to appreciate the difference in the colour of the blood between the two. So for the left side, you've got the venous cannula, which is coming out the femoral vein. It's got the blue taping on it to remind everybody. On the way back in, you've got a oxygenated blood now going in under pressure and flow into the femoral artery and thence up the descending aorta and towards the brain. The little tube with RR pointing to it is a return cannula to perfuse that distal leg, because the ECMO cannula is big enough that it'll occlude most of the blood flow that goes down past the femoral artery. That's something we do for long-term ECMO management in the ITU, but for the CPR situation, not as important. This is an alternative configuration where the venous and arterial cannula has been put in on the same side, and this has been done through a more surgical technique, where what the cannulators have done here is they've made that incision that you can see that has been sewn up. They then dissect it through until they can actually see the femoral artery and the vein next to each other, and then they've put slightly distally, they've inserted the cannulas in and then watched them under direct vision go into their the vein and artery. And this takes slightly longer to do, but it's an alternative technique. And if you're crazy or you're a cardiac surgeon or you're doing this on kids, then you can just open someone's chest and tunnel the lines in that way and go directly into the heart. And if this is being done more electively, so for patients who've got acute heart failure, or they've been having heart surgery and they can't come off bypass, or they might be on the super urgent waiting list for a heart transplant or a ventricular assist device or something like that, then this is often the preferred method. So doing this is one hell of an undertaking, as I'm sure you're starting to realise. And it's a hell of an undertaking to do it semi-electively in the intensive care unit or in the operating theatre, let alone in the emergency department, or whilst you're trying to do all of these things as well. You're trying to do some CPR, you're trying to do all the other things that you might be doing during a cardiac arrest, like defibrillate, or give some thrombolysis or something, which would be a bad idea if you're going to put the patient on ECMO, and maybe do some ultrasound to assess the heart as well. So why should we do it? As I alluded to earlier, the longer your cardiac arrest is, the less likely you are to survive. Now, these are data from out-of-hospital cardiac arrests that fulfill what's called the Uchstein criteria, which is something that researchers use to describe those patients that really shouldn't die. These are people who have witnessed collapses, who have shockable rhythms, and who have bystander CPR within 5 minutes. So these are the patients who should survive. And how many of them do survive? So, even if they get a ROSC immediately, it's still 30% walk out of hospital with a decent neurological outcome. After 20 minutes, that's less than 5%. After 30 minutes, about the same. After 40 minutes, it's pretty much nobody. But we know that actually, if we treat these patients with ECMO and we pick the right ones, that we can get some pretty decent outcomes from some observational studies. This slide is quite busy, but it shows you most of the contemporaneous observational cohort studies of eCPR. The OHCAs, the out-of-hospital cardiac arrests, IHCAs are the in-hospital ones. And you can see that the survival varies from, so the SAVE-J and the Chen et al. Trials are randomized controlled trials of ECMO versus conventional CPR. So you've got 11 versus 2% in Japan, and in Taiwan, which is where the Chen study came from. Whoops. You've got 32 versus 17, and I'm going to go through several of the other studies shortly as well. But you're talking about, and these are all neurologically intact survival. So comparing that slide where you had less than 2%, with most of these which are somewhere between 10 and 40, on a rough data, this appears promising. And the reason we do this is because these patients shouldn't die, and their hearts and their brains are too good to just allow to say, okay, we've done 20 minutes of decent ALS on scene, we should just call it. And there's a bit of an economic argument as well. I might need to update this slide soon. Because actually, if you think about these patients, they're in their 30s, they're in their 40s, and if we can restore them to a good neurological outcome, then the tax we will get back from their earnings is more than enough than any of the cost arguments that people make. And it's the same thing we use to justify the large amounts of money we spend on major trauma patients. This is just me anticipating all of the salvos of criticism that are going to come on, which is, it's too dangerous, nobody survives, and it's too expensive. So who should we do it on? And the analogy I want to give for that is when we talk about mechanical CPR. East of England, do you guys use Lucas's? And who carries them? Is it every ambulance or APP style role? Or team leaders, is it? Yeah, team leaders. So this trial came out. This is a mechanical CPR device, the Lucas 2. I have no conflicts of interest. They don't give me any money. And there was a big trial that came out that about 4 years ago now, called Paramedic, that basically showed that compared to doing CPR in manual CPR, it didn't improve any outcomes for your medical cardiac arrests. And after this, loads of people started saying, oh, well, that's a nail in the coffin for mechanical chest compressions. They don't work. Why would we bother spending any money on them? And I guarantee you that none of those people have tried to do CPR in the back of a moving ambulance. And it's obvious to anybody that, you know, a plastic thing pushing up and down on your chest is not going to save anyone's life on its own. But what it can do is act as a bridge to therapy. It can allow you to be safely transported to something that could fix what's caused you to have your cardiac arrest in the first place. And eCPR is that as well. All ECMO does is it keeps the brain alive in someone whose heart is incapable of doing it. And that on its own is not going to save you. But what it might do is bridge you to something that can. Is that the cath lab? This guy's left main stem coronary artery is absolutely narrow, and that's why he's had his VF arrest. And you can shock him as many times as you like and give him as many drugs as you like, but until that artery's open, he's probably not going to wake up and have his heart start beating again. And if you're stuck in the middle of a field somewhere with someone who's in VF, then can ECMO give you long enough to get to the cath lab to have that procedure? These are all pulmonary emboli that were pulled out of the same patient who had a sudden collapse and was placed on bypass in an emergency department in America and then taken straight to theatre. So if you've got that PE, you know, you can maybe give some thrombolysis pre-hospital if you're in an air ambulance service that supports that, but it's unlikely to dissolve a clot that big. But could ECMO keep that brain alive for the hour it takes to get someone from their house into an operating theatre where a cardiac surgeon can pull that out? This is what ventricular tachycardia looks like if you put it into one of the fancy electrophysiology labs somewhere like Papworth. We see these patients, young patients with electrical storms, 20-year-old athletes who drop down, you know, during the middle of a football game. And they've got undiagnosed ion channel genetic disorders or structural heart disease like hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. And somebody who's clever can find that focus of arrhythmia and can burn it away with a radio frequency ablation catheter, but only if the patient's alive enough for them to do it in the first place. Or maybe, you know, they have this undiagnosed congenital heart condition, but that could recover very well either with transplant or with one of these devices, a left ventricular assist device, which is a durable heart in a box that has its own power supply that people can have very good outcomes of, either whilst they're waiting for a heart transplant and go home, or increasingly as their primary treatment for heart failure. I've met patients who've been on LVADs for 15, 20 years, living full and active lives. Maybe it's just really good intensive care that this patient needs. Let's say they've taken an overdose of beta blockers or calcium channel blockers, tricyclic antidepressants, and they're stuck in this metabolic electrical storm of VT, but actually once all those drugs get metabolized and go away, they'll recover by themselves. And all you need is ECMO to bridge them through that initial gap where their heart just simply won't work. So any of those patients, you could justify using eCPR to keep them going long enough to deliver them as that bridge to the therapy they need to reverse their cause of their cardiac arrest. Sometimes, though, that's not obvious, and you end up in this situation where you have a bridge to nowhere. Or even worse, you have a bridge to somewhere terrible. This is the bridge that goes to a hospital called Medway, which is where we used to get placed at King's, and nobody wanted to go there. But I should have found one of Luton or Peterborough or something for the Cambridge delegation. No offence to anyone who works there. But this is the problem, is that you won't necessarily know all of those things when you're sat in the Grand Arcade with Fraser. You can't be sure that that heart is savable. You have to sometimes just make it as a best guess. And often people say, well, the questions I get is, well, hang on, how many of these patients are going to have massive hypoxic brain injuries and are going to do really badly? And I'll show you some data on that in a second. But fundamentally, I think the patients that could be eligible for this, you need to have three things. You need to have a minimal no-flow time. So you need to have a short period where you weren't getting chest compressions, you weren't getting oxygenated blood to your brain. You need to have a reversible cause of your cardiac arrest or be a candidate for one of those other therapies like a VAD or a transplant or an electrophysiological ablation or something that can actually be fixed and changed. And you also need a baseline function compatible with recovery. So you need to be someone who, at the very least, is, has their cardiac arrest out, walking, and being able to do all of those things. But if you have those three things, there's no reason why eCPR might not be able to bridge you to the therapy you need. And actually, this works even if people are really, really sick. So these are the data from the first cohort of patients who had ECPR at King's College Hospital in London. And I did some of the statistical analysis on this when I was finally a medical student there. And these patients were really, really, really sick. So their median pH of 6.9, a median lactate of 16, and the SOFA is an intensive care scores we use, but trust me, 17 is quite high as well. And people who've worked in hospitals, I know the paramedic guys, you may not be as familiar with the ABG values, but I've seen people try and justify stopping resuscitation because the pH is less than 7, or because the lactate, is in double figures. And that's just fundamentally untrue. They may be associated with poor outcome, but only as part of a bigger picture. What I'm showing this data shows that actually you can have these things which some people would say are unsurvivable, but if you have a reversible cause, and if you have a strategy to bridge them to that therapy, then 40% of the patients with these numbers walked out of hospital. Does anybody know who this man is? I've forgotten his name now, but he's a 106-year-old who runs marathons in sub 3 hours, 2 hours 45, and he goes over. This is him in Boston. He's been in London. He's been in Berlin. And I wonder if he has a VF arrest at the finish line, what's his chance of a good outcome? And you're going to look at me like crazy. You're saying we should put 106-year-olds on ECMO, and the answer is probably not. But I'm saying that simply age isn't everything. This is a fantastic case report from Norway. Any resuscitation practice that you can think of, there's a crazy Scandinavian who's done it already. And this is a northern Norwegian city in Trondheim, where the paramedics were called to a man who tried to fix his boiler and hadn't been able to, and had collapsed and had collapsed into this pool of really cold water around his broken boiler, and was found with a temperature of 28 degrees and in a sinus bradycardia with a scant cardiac output. And as often happens in cases of hypothermia that are rescued, he had a VF arrest the moment they moved him into the ambulance and started driving him to hospital. He was only 10 minutes away, and they looked down at him in ED and they said, well, how old do we think he looks? And they said, well, he looked probably about 75 or 80. He was trying to fix his boiler. That suggests he's fairly independent, right? Let's give it a shot. Let's put him on ECMO. And turned out he was 95. But he was discharged 3 weeks after that that event, and he lived for 3 further years with no neurological. So he had some neurological deficits, but he didn't require. He had a carer once a day or something like that. He had a good quality of life. I'm not suggesting that this becomes standard practice for nonagenarian cardiac arrests. But I am saying is that the patient's physiology doesn't care about how many years they've been alive or anything like that. If you have those 3 things, you have a baseline function compatible with recovery, if you have a reversible cause, and if you have a minimal no-flow time, then you can survive. So when should we do it? The short answer is as soon as possible, once it becomes obvious that this is a refractory cardiac arrest and that they're not going to get better with our conventional algorithm and our usual management. If we put Fraser's cardiac arrest chronologically like this, he has his collapse, he has some CPR, and that's his no-flow time, and we want that to be as short as possible. Once you get above about 5 minutes, probably 10 minutes absolutely, the chance of a good neurological recovery is absolutely minimal. But you also have this low flow time, which is the time between the collapse and the time when you actually manage to get a ROSC, a return of spontaneous circulation. And in the context of our ECPR patients, those are people, that's the time basically between the time their heart stops and when the Ecmo machine is turned on and the blood starts going around the circuit and up the aorta towards the brain. And what we want is for that time to be as short as possible. And when we looked at our data at King's, we found that when we had that less than 60 minutes, we had pretty decent survival to neurological discharge. 60%, 70% in the patients who were between 30 and 60 minutes. Above 60 minutes, we only had 1 survivor, and this was out of about 25 patients. And some guys in critical care did a study of several of those papers that I showed you in the map of the world slide, and they amalgamate all of these, and they came up with an area under the curve. And the same thing showed that after about 60 minutes, your chance of surviving really does tail off. So this is a really good idea, right? Why shouldn't we just do it on everybody at 20 minutes? Surely this is going to create lots of survivors. Well, people like this come and they just say, well, maybe you know, we need to think twice about that. Everyone know who this is? Fabrice Muamba, and you know, he was a Bolton Wanderers midfielder, had a cardiac arrest at White Hart Lane, had 78 minutes of CPR and I think something like 20 defibrillations. But fortunately, there was an electrophysiologist in the crowd who worked at what used to be the London Chest Hospital, and he said, right, you know, don't take him to A&E. I'll ring up my mate who I know is on this weekend. You know, keep doing great CPR. We'll get him into my cath lab because he's probably had one of these electrophysiological events, and we'll see if there's anything else that we can do there to try and reverse it. And that's what they did. And despite having 78 minutes of standard CPR, he made a fantastic neurological outcome. So do these patients really need ECMO, or do they just need a way to, you know, to bridge them to that therapy? I would argue that some of them probably do, but we can't be sure. And this is a graph that I would sort of look at it this way. So you've got the time since the cardiac arrest and the probability of survival, and this black line shows you with standard CPR, and I've adapted that from the slide we saw earlier. You know, it shoots down probably after about 5 or 10 minutes. And if we add a line with eCPR, we can probably shift that curve a little bit to the right. But what we have here is where the curves are close together. Actually, you know, we don't know that this patient isn't going to obtain their spontaneous circulation with our standard cardiac arrest therapies. So the risks of ECMO, and there are significant ones, particularly further down the line, are probably greater than the potential benefit. And once we get after about 60 minutes, several of the other studies have shown us that the eCPR, even then, is probably futile, with a few exceptions, perhaps hypothermia being the most important one. So we need to try and be able to deliver this therapy in this window of maximal benefit. And I haven't labelled these axes because we don't really know when it is. And that leads us on to, well, where should we do it? And there's lots of different experience around the world in different healthcare systems. And the one that Prof. Wilson showed you a slide of, which is the famous photo of ECMO being done in the Louvre that I deliberately haven't put in, so you could show you some different ones. So this is the SAMU de Paris, the pre-hospital service in Paris. It's physician-based, unlike here where we have a strong, you know, paramedic is the primary role in pre-hospital care. Paramedics do exist in France, but a very limited role. It tends to be you either get a firefighter who's BLS trained or you get a doctor turn up to your medical emergency. So ECMO was something that fit slightly easier into their pre-hospital service than perhaps it would to ours. And this guy has had his cardiac arrest outside a metro station in Paris, and he's getting put on ECMO in the street. So that's one place you can do it. This is a simulation from the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. It's available on their website to have a look at. And they're doing simulation of putting a patient on ECMO with chest compressions ongoing in the emergency department. So that's another option. And then this is a guy called Dimitrios Yiannopoulos, who is a cardiologist in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and he's putting someone on ECMO in the cath lab. You can see the C-arm of the I've forgotten what it's called now. The X-ray machine they use in the cath lab. It's called a C-arm. Ready to do the primary coronary intervention. This guy's getting chest compressions from that Lucas device as they speak, and he's being put on ECMO to buy time as they proceed to do a PCI on him. So which is better? Well, those three services have published their data. So one of the first trials that really got people interested in this was from Melbourne. And the top study, the CHEER trial, oh, by the way, I put my Twitter handle at the top, and I think someone from the pre-hospital care program, so I'm tweeting out, hopefully, all of these studies for you to pick up at some point. So if you go to the at Cam Pre-Hosp thing afterwards, then they should be there. So the CHEER trial was in Melbourne, came out about 4 years ago now, and they showed 54% survival from patients who had been dead for a median of 30 minutes before they decided to put the patient on ECMO. And their median time that low flow time from cardiac arrest to ECPR was 56 minutes. So just on that cusp of an hour, and they had over half of their patients walking out of hospital. And ECMO was part of the protocol, but they all had this. They all had mechanical CPR, they had therapeutic hypothermia down to 32 or 33 degrees, they had ECMO, and then they went immediately after initiation of ECMO in ED to the cath lab in the majority of cases. Some patients, I think one patient had a PE, so they went to theatre and had that had an embolectomy, and a couple of other cases had some other treatments depending on the cause of their cardiac arrest. So that was in the ED. The Paris group have published several papers. This is their most recent one, and they looked at their 42 most recent patients doing it on the street. Their survival was 29%, and you can't compare these because they're doing, completely different patient populations. So I should make that clear. Some of them only looked at VF arrests. Some of them took all comers. In particular, the Melbourne group included, I think about half their population, no, about 40% of their population was in hospital cardiac arrest. So that's a different physiology as well. But what I find interesting is in the Paris study, despite the fact that they were doing it pre-hospital, arguably to try and get it done as quickly as possible, their time, their low flow time was actually higher than the in-hospital studies. And the Minnesota study, 62 patients, again with 40%. So I don't think looking at these trials gives you the answer about whether it should be done pre-hospital or in-hospital. But I think it does. This slide does give us some strong evidence that, I know it's not randomised, and the statistical zealots will say, well, this isn't a randomised controlled trial, it's not proper evidence. But we know that these patients, after half an hour of refractory cardiac arrest, are unlikely to have a survival to hospital discharge that high. If we look at the data from Paris a bit longer, they compared 2 periods, and this is basically their timeline, the red being no flow, the green being their CPR time, and the blue being the process from the ECMO team arriving to the Ecmo machine being turned on and ready to go. And the point of this is basically to show that they've got better at it. So since they started doing about 2011, the time's much longer in period 1. Period 2, their times are shortening, and their survival is increasing as well. And this is the data from Minnesota, where basically they compared it to their historical controls, and that's a really bad statistical way of doing a study, but it is interesting that before they started doing ECMO, 15% survival to hospital discharge, and that's with people getting, really good cardiac arrest care in the community, and then coming into the cath lab, 45% after they started doing it. But watch this space, there's a lot more research coming out. In the Netherlands, the Inception trial is coming, is recruiting at the moment. They're powered for 110 patients. The trial's based in Maastricht, but it's all over the Netherlands. And they're doing this in the ED, so it's a randomized control of ECMO CPR versus standard CPR. And they're looking to recruit 110 patients. In Paris, they're doing a trial as well, the Apicar 2 trial, looking to recruit 210 patients. And their strategy is their pre-hospital ECPR service versus taking them to hospital and doing the ECPR in the emergency department. And they'll recruit anyone who's been in cardiac arrest less than 40 minutes from the time to go. In Prague, they're studying this hyper-invasive approach in cardiac arrest, and this should be publishing soon because they've been recruiting since 2012. And what their strategy is either pre-hospital ECMO, then take to the cath lab, or put the Lucas on, scoop and run to the cath lab, and try and do the PCI with chest compressions ongoing. Well, I have seen PCI done with chest compressions ongoing. There's not much data published about it yet. It's pretty difficult to do, and the interventional cardiologists who are doing it are pretty good at it. Of course, with ECMO, you can then switch off the Lucas, and it makes your coronary intervention a lot easier to do. And London Hems have gone on board with this as well, so they've launched a sub-30 trial, and this is their trial protocol, which is available online. At the moment, the last I've heard is that they have funding for a pilot study to aim for 6 patients who are, with the idea, the reason it's called sub-30 is that they're aiming to have patients on ECMO within 30 minutes of their cardiac arrest. And so it's limited to a small geographical area in London within 10 minutes of Bart's Hospital at the moment. And another trial that I'll just mention, because it's not strictly talking about ECMO, but it's talking about this population of refractory cardiac arrest, is this ARREST trial, which is being run down in London as well as all over the country, but it's based down at St Thomas's in London. And this is basically a trial of scoop and run versus stay and play with VF arrest. Do we do what's become the norm now in the United Kingdom with VF arrest and keep them on scene and try and get a ROSC, or do you establish that your first 3 shocks haven't worked, put the mechanical CPR device on and go straight to the cath lab where you'll have someone waiting and hopefully ready to do an intra-arrest PCI? So is this the old pre-hospital care debate of stay and play versus scoop and run? Probably not, but could we move to a model where you have excellent pit crew resuscitation, rapid transport to hospital when it doesn't work, and a system like our major trauma centres where you have a major cardiac arrest centre that can deliver the interventions the patient needs, if that's PCI or ECMO or something else, it's there. And that might be great if you happen to be in Melbourne or Paris or London or Minneapolis where these services are existing. But let's go back to Fraser, who's in Cambridge. He's had his chain of survival. All these things have done really well for him, but he's still got this unmet need. It'll be interesting to see where the data goes on this. But the real challenge, if this is something that we start to see more for the next 10 or 20 years, is not how we do it or where we do it, is how we make sure that this therapy has equity of access across a country the size of the UK. Because a model that works with scooping and running and going to a cath lab might work in London, where you're never more than 20 minutes drive from your nearest cath lab. But if you're somewhere in East Anglia, somewhere up near Kings Lynn or Bury St Edmunds, then we may need an alternative approach, and that may be where pre-hospital ECPR starts to get a bigger role. So, to sum up, as I said at the start of the talk, the things that will save the most lives and make the most difference in cardiac arrest care are bystander CPR, activating responders, getting drones to deliver your defib, and primary prevention. But I think there's still this unmet need, and I think it's something that could potentially change the outcomes for a small number of patients, but change them really meaningfully. And this is something funny on Twitter. So I'm happy to take any questions. I hope that was interesting for you guys. And yeah, thanks again for having me.
So is this actively something that could happen today, were there cardiac arrest going to Edinburgh's A&E?
So depends on where you are. And the answer, so sorry, the question was, well, how likely are we to see this if we go into Addenbrooke's, take a patient into Addenbrooke's A&E? As far as I know, there's no ECMO service at Addenbrooke's. ECMO is only provided at a small number of hospitals in the UK, and traditionally that's been organised around heart and lung transplant centres and hospitals which provide ECMO for severe respiratory failure, of which there are 6 commissioned in the UK and a few others that do it on a non-commissioned basis. Some hospitals have ECPR protocols now, so King's does, St Thomas's does, Bart's and I believe the Royal London do, and Wythenshawe Hospital in Manchester have a protocolised team to the level of crash bleeps for the ECMO team and things like that. But it's very patchy, and that's sort of what I think my final point was. There's lots of scepticism about this. This is a really expensive thing to do, and the Formula One analogy, although it's a bit of a cliche, I think really applies, because this is something you need to be really well drilled for, and you need to, and this would need to be part of a network of simulation and things like that. If you got the Eurostar down to Paris and had your cardiac arrest at the Gare du Nord, I think you might well have this happen. That's the one place where it probably is. Paris and Melbourne, where it probably is sort of the norm rather than well, not quite the norm, but it's a standard part of their pre-hospital care over there.
It's one on live stream, Alex, if you wouldn't mind
Sure.
repeating it. It's what are the risks of pre-hospital ECMO?
What are the risks of pre-hospital ECMO? So I suppose you've got 2 ways to answer that question. So the risks of ECMO in general are not necessarily going to happen to the patient in the pre-hospital phase, but you've got intracerebral hemorrhage is the main one. You have to heparinize the patient and thin their blood, basically. So there are significant risks of strokes, intracerebral bleeds, massive GI bleeds, bleeds elsewhere. Actually, in the CHEER study, the combination of that with the mechanical CPR, 2 of the patients that died actually didn't die because their hearts didn't work. They died because they bled to death from liver injuries and splenic injuries from the hour or so of mechanical CPR they had. So that's the sort of patient level complications. On a wider level, I think doing it pre-hospitally, you've got to be obviously delivering it in a suboptimal environment. The question the skeptics would have is, well, actually, you're going to spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes on scene delivering that intervention. Would it not be better would that not just delay them getting to definitive care? And if you can deliver something like an intra-arrest PCI, or then is ECMO preventing them from actually getting the treatment that they need?
I'm just wondering, do you get good coronary perfusion during ECMO? Obviously, because the artery openings are right at the end next to the valve.
Do you get good coronary perfusion during ECMO? Is an interesting question. The answer is probably, in the context of cardiac arrest, it doesn't really matter, because the point of it is not to perfuse the heart. Ironically, it's to perfuse the brain and the other organs and buy us time to figure out what's wrong with the heart and then try and fix it. We know that long term, and by long term I mean sort of in hours and days, when you've got that, when you're doing femoral VA ECMO and you've got the blood with contraflow up the aorta, you get huge problems with an increase in afterload on the heart, and you get LV dilatation, and that can be disastrous if it goes unchecked, with big clots in the LV and stroke and things. And those hearts, sometimes don't recover. So there are strategies for managing that, and there are issues with that. But you get a reasonable amount of perfusion. We know that in the patients who are supported with short-term ECMO as bridges to their, most of these patients end up on ECMO for about a day or 2. We know that those patients don't then suffer a particularly increased amount of, type 2 MIs or things like that. But it would be interesting to see the follow-up data of their, echocardiograms at 2 years, 5 years, or whatever, to see if that had an effect. I don't know, is the short answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. So yeah, thank you for a really fascinating talk that was both the basics and sort of innovative practice as well. It was really interesting. Thank you. So our next forum, guys, is the 27th of June. We're going to be doing traumatic cardiac arrest by Dr. Ed Barnard. I'll just come up in a second. And the URL, so again, if you have or haven't used this before, we've shortened it so it's a bit quicker. You do have to do the feedback link, but it is much quicker now. And then once you've done the feedback for us and submitted, there'll be a link underneath that for your certificate. So if you take a picture of the URL, I'll keep it up there, and hopefully we'll see you next month. So thank you very much.
Yeah.